It's about to start, we'll talk about code or whatever we'll talk about today. It's about to start, so please hang tight while I check that everything is okay. Sound check, camera check, lights check. How's my hair? Oh, wait, I don't have any hair. Maybe put some pants on and I am good to go. So get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Hi, my name is Leandro Facchinetti, and let's write some code together, shall we? What we have on the menu today is the tricky problem of parameters. Let's say it's the tricky problem of parameters, because a parameter in this context that I'm talking about is, for instance, a volume, input-output gain, or attack and release, or a threshold, or something like that. The same parameter is modified in a bunch of different places, and these places have to be kept in sync. There is a whole lot of logic that needs to happen for that to go well. And right now there is a problem in the auto mixer, which is the effect that we have been working on in this series of streams. And the auto mixer has this notion of syncing parameters across plugin instances. And the way that this is working is actually breaking when you save a project and reopen the project, your settings are gone. Terrible. So we need to think hard. We are going to spend most of today just talking and thinking, but we have to think hard and try and solve this problem of synchronizing the parameter values across all the places where they appear. And Mage and Taylor here on the chat. Hello, great to see you. Thanks for joining me. To begin with, let's go over all the different places in which a parameter appears. This is the source for the volume effect that we played with yesterday. The point was to do some good looking buttons, knobs on the user interface. And I think that we achieved that. I think that they're looking fine. I'm gonna bring them up once more. Very simple, but effective. And so let's go over this code. It's not too big, less than 100 lines. And let's identify all the places where we have a parameter going on. I'm not going to call them sliders anymore. I'm going to refer to these as sliders. The JSFX concept of a slider will be called slider, and this will be called parameters. I think that this is the name used in other contexts like VSTs, audio units, iPlug, Juice, and so forth. I think that they use the terminology parameter. That's what I'm going for here. Correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway, to begin with, we have the actual JSFX sliders, and these are, in many instances, the source of truth, because these are the things that you can control with automation, for instance. We can hide this if we want, but, and I guess in theory, we don't even need this. If we have this, we could just forgo sliders entirely, but they are a good thing because you can come here to param and then automate them using automation on the track or parameter modulation and so on. So these features are of course great. So we want to have the actual JSFX sliders in place. As far as I know, there is no way of doing automation if not with the default JSFX sliders. Could be nice to have some other ways of declaring this besides sliders, but it doesn't exist. So we will need to keep sliders around. So that's the first place in which the parameters appear, sliders. The actual JSFX sliders. All right, and Juan is here. It's fine. Don't be sorry that you have been away. It's fine. How are you doing? Then, in the slider section, we have this other, it's not exactly the parameter, but it's based on the parameters. The point of the slider section is that you will take your sliders and compute derived values from them. The example here being you are giving a volume in dB, but you would like to work with that volume in linear, so you convert from dB to linear in the slider section. So that's the second place in which parameters occur. I'm going to call this the derived . Did I spell this right? Derived, yes. Derived values, or derived parameters. Let's call them derived parameters. And I'm going to keep them here on this mind map because we know that if the sliders are the source of truth because of automation, parameter modulation, and all that, if the sliders are the source of truth, then the derived parameters are the things that we actually use in the code. When we are doing the audio portion of things, we will be looking at the derived parameters. So anytime that we change this source of truth, we have to update this as well. That's, of course, the intent of this slider function in this case. Typically, it's the intent of the slider section, but it so happens that for reasons that we are about to see, we may need to call the slider function, which will recompute the derived values. We may need to call this from other places that don't necessarily have to do with changing an actual slider. Then we find this line, which is kind of interesting, because there is another place where we have this notion of the parameter, and that is on the user interface. And the reason for this is that when you're clicking and dragging, you can see that it can drag a little bit before it goes to the next value. And that means that internally, we have to keep track of things like, right now you are, so I'm going to start again. You click and hold. So right now you are at 7 dB. Then you move up just a little bit. You are at, let's say, 7.5 dB. This value is quantized to the dB. So we will not show 7.5. We will not compute with 7.5. For all effects and purposes, the parameter is still 7 dB. But we need to keep track of that 7.5 because as I move further up, now I am at 7.8. And then eventually I get to 8. So we need this internal value that is not quantized for click and drag to work, which means that we need this variable. So here is a third place where parameters appear. And I'm going to call this the @GFX graphics. And again, these values are linked to some extent, the same way that these values are linked. They're not the same thing. So we need to keep track of them separately, and we need to sync them when time comes. Then there is the Serialize section that with the default sliders, we don't have to do much work to serialize and deserialize parameters. And when I say serialize and deserialize, I mean when you save the REAPER project, you are serializing those values, putting them in series into a REAPER project file. And when you're loading the project, you are deserializing. You are taking this text file effectively, reading the values off of them, and putting them back into variables into your effect. So you're deserializing these values. And by default, REAPER will serialize the sliders for you. There is one little trick that is the sliders are represented with 64 bits, and when serialized, they become 32-bit. But for the most part, you don't have to worry about this. So we can work under the assumption that the sliders are serialized for free and deserialized for free. But there may be reasons for you to store stuff in the Serialize section. Extra stuff that doesn't have to do with the sliders. So we could store anything here. We could, for instance, store this, which is a bit silly, but suppose that we wanted to preserve your mouse position when clicking and dragging across closing and reopening a project, which is of course very silly, but we could store this variable in the REAPER project and restore it, and then the cursor position would be preserved. And in the AutoMixer, I think we will need something like that for the group parameters and that sort of thing. So there you go. That's another place, the add Serialize, which really is standing in for the REAPER project when you save it. Yeah. Today it's not so much about sharing knowledge, it is more about working together through a hard problem. It is a somewhat silly problem, but it is one of those hard problems that one has to work through, and there are so many details and edge cases. And Bo is here. Hello, Bo. You know what this reminds me of? We have all these moving parts and we need to connect them the right way. This reminds me of when I was working on my day job, which I will open on a private tab because I don't want to be logged in. So on my day job, it is a web application, and we need to be able to sign people up and sign people in. This is loading remarkably slow. Is it because of the stream? I don't know. Anyway, there are all these different ways you can get into the system. You can sign up, you can receive an invitation via email, you can follow an invitation sent by some other means. So it's an invitation link that you follow. And when you are following an invitation link or when you receive an invitation email, you may already have an account or you may be new to the system. There is like 1,000 different variations on this. You may have an account and be signed in. You may have an account and be signed out. 1,000 different variations. And it was so tricky to get every detail right. I think that at this point we did. And I'm not even talking about the hard problems of like making sure that your passwords are stored in a way that is secure and that you're not leaking your database. That sort of thing is taken for granted here in this conversation I'm having. The tricky part was mostly finding out all the ways you could get into the application and making sure that you never get lost, that all the workflows take you from beginning to end without distractions. So for instance, if you are receiving an invitation link to join the system and be part of a course, and you have not created an account yet, you will have to create your account and then receive a confirmation email to confirm your email. And when you click on that confirmation email, you are sent back into the system and you must be redirected to the invitation so that you can accept the invitation. So like that, there are all sorts of tricky little details that really take a lot of time and a lot of thinking to work through. And I find a parallel between that and this situation we are in. Like, it's so mundane. It's definitely not sexy, but when you get everything right, it feels effortless. It feels so nice. And in course lore, I think that that's the case. At least I haven't heard complaints recently. So you don't even notice that everything has gone right. You received an invitation, you were able to follow or create your account or confirm your email or whatever the case may be. And it just works. And yeah, that's the problem we are working on right now. All these different ways of syncing parameters across all the places where they appear. And Aviated Views sound is here. Hello. What's up is that we are working through not sexy, but complicated problem and necessary problem that is syncing parameters across all the places where they appear. All right. So next, we are here in the JSFX section, and let's see if there is another place where parameters occur. I don't think so, not on this effect. But on the automixer, there is, I'm not gonna go over the entire automixer because it is already very long, but we know that there is a place that parameters appear on. There is another place in which parameters appear. And that is the concept of syncing the parameters across plugin instances. Let me show you because it has been a while since we worked on the automixer proper. So check this out. These sliders are synced across plugin instances. This is on track 1, this is on track 2. But when I move one, the other moves along. And the priority is not linked. So they really are not the same instance, but they go together in some parameters, and they go separately in other parameters. So for that to work, we need the global memory. So that's yet another place in which parameters may appear. And I think that's the final one, gmem. That's the last one I can think of anyway. All right, so those are the places where parameters appear. Now we have to work through the workflows, the life cycle of the plugin. And think about all the operations that happen. And then think about what the management should look like what place needs to be copied into what other place. So let's think through the life cycle of a plugin. First, there is the first plugin instance that is loaded into the project. That's different from subsequent plugin instances. So actually it works like this. The first time your plugin is loaded into a project is kind of special because there are guarantees, at least I think there are guarantees about this. Experimentally, it seems like there are guarantees about this, that the global memory will be all zeros. So the first instance of the plugin loading into a new REAPER project is the first event in the life cycle of a plugin. Let's take note of that. So the first instance loading. But then there are the subsequent instances. Loading. You know what? I think I need to number. Instead of just listing, I'm going to number them. 1 and 2. And I'm going to label this with letters. I think that this is going to come in handy later when we start drawing conclusions from all this. Now, what's different between the first and the subsequent instances is that the first will have these guarantees about the global memory being empty, for instance, being all zeros. And subsequent instances will not have that guarantee, of course, and as intended, because then there may be stuff in the global memory for the subsequent plugin instances to look at. For instance, the syncing of the parameters across plugin instances will work by looking at the global memory when a subsequent instance is loaded. And then what is kind of interesting is that if you remove all the plugin instances from the project, it seems like REAPER forgets about that plugin. And then the next time you load it, it is as if it was the first instance in the project, because REAPER will zero out the global memory for that plugin. At least it seems like REAPER does that. But even if it doesn't do that all the time, I think that for our purposes, it doesn't matter. If there is some stuff in the global memory, all that means is that the new plugin instance will be treated the same as a subsequent plugin instance, and that's fine for our purpose, I think. Can you use a cascading spreadsheet external file to draw geometric values in JSFX to draw the graphical designs? Or we could create a graphical framework to make it easier to draw an interface. Okay, I think I understand your question. Can you use a cascading spreadsheet external file to draw geometric values in JSFX to draw the graphical designs? I think that what you're asking is, can you have a spreadsheet like in Excel where you perhaps input the coordinates of some buttons, labels, waveform components, whatever, and then have JSFX read that? So if that's the case, my answer to you is probably not directly. You wouldn't want to read the spreadsheet in JSFX, but there could be some glue between your spreadsheet and JSFX. I don't know of any, but there could be something like that. And I remember seeing something related to this in the REAPER forums. I think that there was someone who did some kind of user interface library for JSFX, or maybe it was ReScript. I don't remember. And there was some kind of drag and drop tool. So you could drag components like buttons and draw your user interface like that. Yeah, and it's more like a graphical framework. And yes, there are some. Oh, so you mean like in CSS? Okay, that's a different thing then. I was thinking of spreadsheets, but yeah, CSS as in cascading style sheet, that's a different story. So when you have something like, Well, first of all, the cascading aspect is really tricky. I don't think there is any library in JSFX that does anything like that because it's super tricky, but the layout engine is probably more interesting here. The cascading part is super useful when you are on the web and your documents may have embedded documents and you would like the style to be consistent and that sort of thing. So cascading on the web makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make as much sense in this context, but the layout system is something that is super interesting. And there is at least one library I know of that does something along those lines. This library does something like that. So you may think that these components were put here by giving coordinates, but really there is this concept of stacks of components. So if you know CSS, you may have heard of Flexbox. It's not Flexbox, but it's the closest analog I can think of. So you can say something like, I want this to be a vertical stacking context with 1, 2, and 3 elements. Then this element can be a Flexbox kind of thing where you're saying this is a stacking context that is horizontal with 1 and 2 elements, and so on and so forth. So here would be a horizontal stacking context with 4 elements. This would be a vertical stacking context with 4 elements, and so on. And again, this is not a CSS because it's not cascading, but the code really looks really nice and resembles this structure I just talked about. Yeah, the code ends up looking like this. So you say something like start a new context, then you give some properties about that context, and then you put stuff in that context, and then you pop out of that context. So if you pretend that this is like you can pretend that this is like an opening brace in CSS and pretend that this is like a closing brace in CSS. And I guess that's why Geraint indented the code this way. And if you reason about it like that, it is somewhat close to what you do in CSS. For the time being, I'm not going to pursue this, I don't think. I can see the advantage of doing things this way because you're defining things in terms of coordinates, but I'm not even sure if these are coordinates. These may be percentages. And that's much more interesting because your user interface is scalable without you having to do a lot of work for that. So that's super neat. But this whole concept is complicated, both from the perspective of implementation as well as for the concept, the perspective of trying to explain this to people. Geraint had to write a great tutorial, by the way, that comes with an example plugin and everything. It's super nice. But there is a lot of concepts that you have to understand in order to be able to use this. And even the problem of scalable interfaces, I'm not so sure that this is going to be absolutely necessary to go into this level of complexity for this. Because when you're talking about something like CSS, you are thinking about the web. You may be on a phone, you may be on the computer or a desktop, you may be on a tablet, you may have your phone on portrait mode or landscape. Different phones, different browsers will show things differently. So CSS makes a lot of sense in that context because you have very little control over the environment. But in JSFX in particular, but also in plugins in general, you have a lot more control over the environment. You can ask for a certain window size. You may be given that window size, you may not be given that window size because maybe you asked for a window size that is too large or the user has the effects blocked somewhere. Anyway, there are cases in which you don't get the size you want, but you have a lot more control than on the web. And also, even when I am designing for the web, I find that there are some things that need to be shown and hidden, but for the most part, you have certain components that will kind of look the same. So for instance, let's look at this interface. This thing right here, it will be the same when I resize the window. It goes, and then when the window isn't large enough to show it, it is hidden under this. But that doesn't change. And yes, it has been placed with respect to the right margin, so there is a little bit of clever mathematics you have to do to find the right offset to place these components, so the coordinates aren't really trivial. But still, this whole component here is one piece, and that's what I find in most of the interfaces that I design. I have these little widgets, let's say, these little partials, or as one would say these days on the web, these little components that go along as a unit, and then you place this, you lay these components out on the page somehow, and then you show and hide them. And then there are just a couple components that make sense as flexible sized components, because these are not flexibly sized. This is a rigid size. We can ask for its size. In this case, it is 330 pixels, and that doesn't change. So there are some components that are flexible, like the text box in this case, this main area is flexible. And in the case of audio plugins, I think that most of the user interface will fall into this category, where things have a fixed size and have just one block. And then there are just like a couple components that probably we want to make flexible, like a waveform display, a frequency response. Those kinds of components may make sense as flexible components. So what I'm saying here is that having spreadsheets or having style sheets will not do a lot of work for us. They will do a little bit of work, and maybe having something like a drag and drop kind of thing would be nice, because we wouldn't have to find the coordinates for everything, which is annoying to have to do. But it would not buy us a lot, because unlike the web, we have much more control over the environment. And I think that most of the interfaces, at least that I am planning on designing, will be mostly fixed size. And then we may have a couple components that are flexibly sized. So CSS wouldn't buy us a lot. And this whole abstraction here on this library, I think would be overkill for the kind of interface that I'm thinking about. And I'm not thinking about going to interfaces that are much more complex than this. With sliders, we probably will not even have dials, and we will have buttons and some waveform displays, but I think you don't need much more than this. Yeah. This library is way beyond my expectations for my own library. For instance, I don't care about themes, and I don't. Oh yeah, the concept of multiple screens may come in handy, but some of these rich built-in controls may be unnecessary, like the knobless buttons that we are talking about, that renders the dials unnecessary. Anyway, that was a lot of explanation. But I hope it makes sense, and I hope it justifies some of my decisions, and hopefully that makes sense to you. If you update a built-in slider programmatically, is that slider the last touched on the param dropdown? That's an excellent question, because I forgot to mention this yesterday when we were playing around with this. So we have here the test plugin, which has one slider that you can control via the user interface. But if you control that via the user interface, it does not show here as a touched FX parameter. You can always come in here and find it. It's there. But it's nice to have it here as the last touched FX. And I think that that's what you're asking about, right? So that's not happening right now. And we learned about this from John Matthews from Toucan Studios when he was over for, I guess, 1 week ago or 2 weeks ago for a conversation about user interfaces and knobs and so on. So what we learned is that we want to call slider automate when that happens. So let's find this. So these are the places where we are changing the value of the slider programmatically, because the user clicked and dragged on the user interface. And then we call this function called slider automate. Let's see if I got the name right. I did. What I did right now was just do a search on my whole folder, which is where every JSFX is installed. And because there are thousands of occurrences of this, it means that I got the right name. Anyway, so when I call slider automate, then I'm indicating to JSFX that I have changed this value programmatically, and I'm interested in putting that on the last touched parameter. Because if I just change this variable, then JSFX knows that I changed the slider programmatically and updates the slider. You can see that it's moving left and right, but it's not showing up here. And that's what slider automate does. So now that I saved this, I can reload the plugin and move the slider, and there it is. Yeah, thanks for remembering me that I was missing this. If you didn't want to do a proper flow interface, you could design an old school sprite batching engine. Yeah, when John Matthews was over, we looked at one of those, the sprite batching, I guess. I guess that's what you mean by sprite batching. And we looked at JKnobman, which is this little app that helps you design knobs, and then it exports one PNG that is just a sprite map. It looks something like this, the PNG. And then you just bleach the PNG, you plot the PNG on the page, you render the PNG, and you pick the right viewport into the PNG, and then you can do a knob that rotates as you click and drag. Yeah, I could do something like that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to try to stick to the primitives in JSFX and not deal with images. We'll see. There are advantages to either. These kinds of knobs can look much nicer. They can have gradients and shadows and insets and whatnot. What the heck's going on here? WTF. But there are advantages to doing things my way, of just using the bare primitives for drawing. Namely, we are vector-based, because these drawing primitives in JSFX are vector-based. And that means it is not going to look blurry on Retina displays, and we don't have to deal with managing images. It's kind of nice. Anyway, Remo is here. Hello, it's great to have you here. And thanks for the comment. That's Portuguese, by the way. But it's just a compliment. All right, so good thinking there. Let's return to the problem of the life cycle of a plugin. You first load the first instance. Then you may load subsequent instances. The next thing you will do, probably, is to play around with sliders. And there are two ways you can play around with a slider. You can use the native JSFX slider, or you can use the GFX slider. Or you may do something that changes the sliders programmatically. In our case, we don't have an example of this, but we can go, for instance, to limiter 3 by Toucan Studios. If you want to learn more about this, then go watch the latest video on the Toucan Studios YouTube channel, which was made by me. So this last Sunday, I introduced limiter 3, and it has this feature that links to sliders or to knobs. And hang on, what? Why is this not working now? Interesting. Am I doing something silly? I don't think I am. Do I have the right plugin? Seems like I do. Weird. Anyway, the point of this is that when you change the limit, the out gain was supposed to change as well, so as to link these two knobs in a way that compensates. So if your limit is minus 32, your out gain is 32. And when you move this like this one will move like that to compensate. Anyway, it doesn't seem to be working right now for whatever reason. I'm not sure why. But the point of this is that there may be some function like this function that treats the limit knob that will change the value of this parameter. So I guess there are at least 3 ways that I can think of to change the value of a parameter on the user interface. So let's go through this again. You may change a JSFX native slider. You may change a GFX slider, or you may do a programmatic change to parameter. The bad thing about writing by hand is that there is no spell check, so I'm not sure I spelled this right. Whatever. So you do your slider changes, then depending on the plugin, and I guess that's very special of our auto mixer. I don't remember many other plugins, or I don't remember any other plugin that does this. But there is another way that a parameter may be changed, and that's via the global synchronization, the group-wide parameters in the auto mixer, where you change one parameter in one instance and it will change the parameter on the other instance. So let's add that to the list as a 6th workflow situation that may happen. And that is syncing I'm going to call this the global parameters. To some extent, This is a programmatic change to a parameter because it is linking parameters in much the same way as the limiter tree situation I just showed. But I think that this is a special case because it has to deal with the global memory. Anyway, the next thing that may happen is that you may save the REAPER project, close REAPER, reopen REAPER, reopen the project. So there are two things that happen. Save and close, and open and restore, or something like that. Save the project and close REAPER, and open REAPER and restore the project. Can you think of anything else? I cannot. I think that we covered all the different workflows that affect parameters, that affect the life cycle of parameters. We thought of all the different workflows and then some, because this global syncing is not common. It's kind of a special requirement. This looks beautiful. What looks beautiful? I'm interested in knowing, because you probably said this while I was showing the thing, but are you talking about Gerent's library? Are you talking about knobmem? I need to stop coming to this page. Are you talking about what looks beautiful? Are you talking about limiter tree? You certainly are not talking about this, because that's not beautiful. But I think that it looks pretty good, actually. I'm looking forward to actually having a whole interface based on this concept, because I think it will look super nice. Anyway, maybe it somehow doesn't work because the track is muted. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, the track auto-muted because I was playing around with some parameters that glitched out. You are right. Interesting. So I guess we just learned something about the implementation of limiter tree. When audio is not being processed, the parameters are not linked. Huh. There you have it. Is this like a bug? I think it is kind of a bug that I could report to John. Because we have to think about this case where your plugin is bypassed, but the user interface is open, which is something very common, actually. When you are playing around with a plugin, you may want to bypass to listen to what it does. And then maybe you are like, I'm listening to the limiter and I think, do I like what I hear? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I think I would like a lower limit. And then you do this. And yeah, well, fair. The next time you unbypass, it's going to link. But it could be confusing for a user to be like, oh no, why is the linking no longer working? Like it was confusing for me. So I think that this link should occur in the user interface treatment, not on the audio treatment. Yeah, as always, Tail. Tail is saving the day again. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. That's what's happening. Yeah, let's take note of this. We will want to report this to John. Right. Good thinking there. Bad spellers of the world, Exactly. So we thought about all the different places where parameters appear, and we thought about all the workflows. Now we have to think about what are the implications when one of these things happen. What should happen in terms of all of these places where the parameters occur? That's the big question, really. That's the hard thinking that we have to do. So when the first instance of the plugin is loading, and we have a plugin like the Automixer that will do syncing of parameters across plugin instances, I think it's necessary for us to initialize the global memory. Oh, you know what? I'm thinking about a consequence of this already. You know what I just noticed? I don't know if you can see this, but there is a bit of yellow here. This is the same piece of paper I used on the limiter tree video, the video that I was talking about a moment ago. Go watch that video. It is great. Yeah, so there is this situation of knowing if it is the first instance of, or if it is a subsequent instance, or if it is just restoring from an existing project. Because I think there may be different things that we want to do in these three cases. For one thing, in this situation, we want to write to the global memory to initialize it. So the global memory is not the source of truth, but when you load a subsequent instance, the global memory is the source of truth, and you should be copying from the global memory into the sliders. And when you are loading the first instance, you will be initializing the memory. You will not be treating that as the source of truth. So we need a way to differentiate between these scenarios. It is super straightforward. It is, in fact, something that we easily do already. We already know how to differentiate between changing a JSFX slider versus a GFX slider. That's very straightforward. And programmatic changes to parameters are also straightforward. Syncing global parameter. Is this how you spell syncing? I don't think there is an H there. Let's remove the H from here. So these are all very straightforward. But these three, 1, 2, and 8, we need to know how to tell them apart. Question mark. We have a tentative answer to these two in the Automixer. We have this notion of registering instances into the global memory. So we have a counter of how many instances exist, and that helps us differentiate between the first and the second states. We sort of implemented this kind of ad hoc as we were finding a problem and solving it, finding a problem and solving it, before we decided that it was time to actually think about this in a principled manner and list everything out and work through the cases. So when we were just sketching things out, we found a way of differentiating between these two situations. I will show you what that looks like. We have this, which is a global variable that is always incremented anytime you load a plugin. So the init block will only run once. And at that point, we register that plugin and we give that a number, an identifier that is unique across plugin instances. and we can see if this is 0. And if it is 0, it means that we are in case number 1. We are the first plugin instance that is loading. And if it's not 0, we are in case number 2. We are subsequent instances that are loading. And if we are the first instance, then we initialize the global memory. The thing that I was just talking about. Look, the banana comment. This has been here for a while now, a couple weeks actually. Banana was us doing some ad hoc treatment of this whole situation we are in when we were trying to wing it. Didn't work out. We're having to think more formally about this. But anyway, banana is the marker for places we will need to revisit, and there are only 3. But these are the places where we are doing some ad hoc solutions for the problems we're thinking about. So anyway, we have a way of distinguishing between cases 1 and 2. But we need a way to distinguish between cases 1 and 8. So coming back here to the list, we need a way of distinguishing between the first instance they load from the effects browser. So we need a way of finding out if we did something like this, or if the plugin loaded from an existing project. By the way, it is kind of late, so macOS switched into dark mode, and in dark mode, the plugin looks even better. It goes so well with the rest of the interface. This color kind of matches this color, and when I click and hold, this color kind of matches this color. Yeah, it's looking super nice. Lovely. So coming back here, can we tell cases 1 and 8 apart? I think we can. Again, in this situation, we want to do something different here. We will want to look at Serialize, because perhaps Serialize will be the source of truth in that case. So the question really is, can we tell if we have been loaded straight from the effects browser or if we have been loaded from an existing REAPER project? I think we can, and I think that Serialize is the key, but I don't know for a fact. So let's do a quick experiment to try this out. Either that, or we can wait a couple minutes to see if Dale has the answer for that already. No, but let's do the experiment. And I will call this Serialize. I'm going to write this a long way. It's kind of silly, but 1 represents true and 0 represents false. By default, variables are 0 when they have not been initialized. So by default, this will be 0. And we set it to 1, so this is redundant. But I'm spelling this out like this so that it is very clear that what I'm doing is hello should be 0 if we have been loaded from the effects browser, and hello should be 1 if we have been loaded from an existing REAPER project. And that is because the init block will run. Is this how this works? I think that this is how this works. So the init block will run when you first load the effect from the effects browser, but Serialize will not. And if you are loading an existing Reaper project, Serialize will run first and then init will run. So this way we can detect whether we need to initialize the global memory or not. I think that this is how this works. Let's try it out. Oh no. Hello is 1. Which means that it ran the Serialize block. Yikes. Why did it run the Serialize block? And why, when I do a full compile reset, it sets everything back to 0? Then it's back to 1. And if I do a full compile reset, it sets it back to 0. If I hold Command and click on Edit, it will reload the plugin, and it's always 0. Is this a Heisenbug? Do you know of Heisenbugs? I misspelled it. Hey, untie people, untie. Yeah, Heisenbug is a bug that disappears or changes its behavior if you attempt to look at it. And I am attempting to look at it by looking at this. So is this a Heisenbug? Maybe. So you know what we can do? We can set hello as a slider. Because this way, when we load the plugin, we see the value of the slider without having to look into the debugger. Now, this is no longer a Heisenberg because we have not opened the editor and we still see 1 here. Crap. There is no straightforward way of knowing if we have been loaded for the first time or if we have been loaded from an existing project. Let's look at other things we can do in the Serialize section. Probably file var is the easiest to deal with. Yeah, file var seems to be the one we want. I have not used the Serialize section all that much, so I don't know it off the top of my head, but it seems like we want to use file var. And as far as the index, the handle, maybe we don't use any. No, we use number 0. So now what we are doing is very silly actually, but this should write and read. The serialize block is weird. It should write and read this variable from the Reaper project. When we are reading when we are loading the plugin, it will be reading from the Reaper project, and when we are saving the project, it will be writing to the project. So this file var plays two roles depending on the context. When we are reading, this will be loading from a file, and when we are saving, it is writing to a file. So my thinking goes like this. The first time we load the plugin into the track, it will run the serialize block, as we just learned. And it will set this variable to 1, and it will attempt to read. I think that's what it's going to do. It will attempt to read, because we are loading the plugin for the first time. So it will attempt to read this variable from the project, and it will find a 0 there, or it won't find anything there because there isn't anything in the Reaper project yet. So it will set this to 0, and then we'll successfully distinguish between cases 1 and 8. Place your bets. Do you think that this is what's going to happen? It's not what happens. Probably there is some special case for when you're trying to read for the first time. Perhaps file var is just skipped. I don't know. There is no way of distinguishing between cases 1 and 8, as far as I can tell. Oh well, bummer. We'll figure something out. Or maybe it will not matter. Well, no, we know it matters because we know there is a bug already in the automixer where the global parameters are forgotten in this case. We'll figure something out. But we will not continue figuring this out right now. We will continue figuring this out tomorrow. So the plan is that tomorrow I will be back and I will be working on this difficult problem some more. And look who is here. There is a way. Compare the state of the variable to a fixed number, which should be the initial state. Or did I just miss the topic? Maybe you know the answer. Let's see. Compare the state of the variable to a fixed number, which should be the initial stage. I'm not sure I understand that. So to reiterate, the topic is we are working on that problem we talked about yesterday, that your parameters, I'm calling them parameters, they appear in many places in the JSFX sliders, in your graphical user interface, in your serialization. There are derived parameters from this, so maybe you have something in DB and you want something in linear. In my case, in the automixer, I want to sync parameters across plugin instances. So the same concept is represented in these 5 different places, and we need to sync things up. That's what we mentioned yesterday as a difficult problem, and I'm tackling this now. I'm starting to tackle this now. And then also I identified all the possible actions you can take with these parameters. So things like changing a JSFX slider, changing a slider from the user interface, and so on. And I'm trying to distinguish between loading a plugin for the first time coming from the effects browser and loading a plugin because you have saved the project, closed Reaper, reopened Reaper, and reopened the project. I'm trying to tell these two cases apart. So in both cases, it is the first plugin that will be loaded in the project, but I need to know, is it being loaded from the Reaper project or from the effects browser? And that will change the treatment of the global memory. Because if we are loading an instance for the first time, we want to initialize the global memory. But if we are restoring from an existing Reaper project, then we want to perhaps treat the global memory as the source of truth. So I'm trying to distinguish between these two. And I wasn't able to succeed first try. In a serialized block, this file avail 0 returns 0 in read mode if memory was not previously serialized. That's a good point. Well, let's see. Let's look at JSFX documentation for this real quick. Oh, hang on. Maybe they have explained this already. Pass 0 as the handle. That's what we did, but do not call file open or file close. Fair enough, we didn't. Simple serialized code will often appear the same for read and write as file var of that will read write depending on the mode. That's what I talked about, how when you are loading the plugin, it is in read mode and file var will read a variable. And when you're saving the project, it is in write mode, so file var will write that variable. If you want to have different logic per mode, you can check that to determine if it is in read mode. Okay, so this is, I think, what you are talking about. And I don't think that this will do the thing we want. I think that what this does is to check whether we are reading or writing. And what we want is to know if we are loading the plugin for the first time or loading the plugin from a Reaper project. But you know what? Let's give it a try, because maybe this will be the key. And then we will wrap up. Said I was going to wrap up. Okay, so I'm not even sure what I want to expect from this, but I know for a fact that let's close Reaper, just in case. Let's close Reaper. Let's get a new Reaper instance and load the test plugin. No, it's called the Serialize plugin. Okay, when the plugin is fresh, hello is 0. Then I will save this project. And then I will close Reaper. Then I will open Reaper again. I will go to my little project, open it, and it's 0s2. Yeah, so this confirms my expectation. As I explained, that is to differentiate between read and write modes. So you can tell if your file var that you could have here, is it going to write into the Reaper project or is it going to read from the Reaper project? So this helps us differentiate between these two cases. But that's not what we are interested in. In both cases, we are in read mode, so to speak, because we are loading the plugin. So we are in read mode. But the trick is, are we in read mode coming from an existing project or from the effects browser? And that is what I don't know how to detect. And that is, by the way, what's messing with the auto mixer right now. Yeah, you are welcome. It will be plus VE if there is data to be read and 0 if there is none. 0 because you haven't serialized any data, and minus VE in write mode on save project. Are you saying that it's 0 because I have not serialized any data? Okay. I'll give this another try. Maybe I am misunderstanding something. So I think you want me to serialize data before I check this, right? So let's copy this, which is a trick that I learned from Geraint Love, from his library, from reading his awesome documentation. The library that I showed before, the user interface library, documents this trick of storing the version of the plugin in the Serialize section, because if you update the plugin, you can do some migration of parameters. Anyway, now I will be storing something before I ask about this. Let's try it again. New Reaper instance. I loaded from the effects browser and I got a 0. I'm gonna call this Serialize 2. Close Reaper. Reopen. Serialize 2. 1. Oh, there you go. You were right. I am wrong. This is the way you differentiate between these two states. Awesome. Thanks for the answer. Now we know. So tomorrow we will be back here and we'll be working our way through all the 8 different scenarios, thinking about what we want to do in each scenario and documenting/implementing this and hopefully fixing the auto mixer. That's what's up tomorrow. So yeah, let's wrap this up. Thank you to Mage, John, Dale, Aviated Sounds, Remo, and Bo and Juan for joining me on the chat. Thank you to and for giving me the answers to the questions. It's awesome that you all are here joining me and teaching me stuff. And thank you to everyone else who's watching this in the future. I hope you have a great time. And tomorrow we'll be back for some more JSFX. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you for watching the stream. You know how great it has been. Or maybe it sucked, and I am glad that you stuck with me. And so we'll all be back together for some more coding or talking or chilling. The next time I'll be streaming.